You know, a shadow stretches across Eastern Europe, but it's not a new one. It's the shadow of a fallen empire. To really understand what's happening in Ukraine today, looking at the news just isn't enough. We have to go back. We have to look at the history that lit the fuse.
So why is Russia fighting Ukraine? It seems like a straightforward question, right? But the answer, well, it's a tangled web of shared history, national pride, and a bitter, decades-long fight over which way to face, east toward Russia or west toward Europe.
To untangle that web, we need to rewind the clock. We're going back more than 30 years, to the moment a superpower crumbled, and the end of one world drew the battle lines for a new one.
Okay, so our story really begins with what we can call the Soviet fracture. This wasn't just the end of an era. It was the start of a brand new and incredibly complicated relationship between two nations tied together by centuries of history, but now, suddenly, on their own paths. The year is 1991. The hammer and sickle, the symbol of Soviet power, falls for the very last time. As the USSR dissolves, you have millions of people celebrating in the streets. But behind closed doors, in the halls of power, a totally new and frightening era of uncertainty was just getting started.
And right at the heart of all this change was Ukraine. For centuries it had lived under Moscow's rule, but now it was its own country. For Ukrainians, it was an absolute dream come true. But for a weakened Russia, it was like losing a part of itself, a key piece of what it always considered its own backyard.
The new battle lines were drawn almost immediately. As Ukraine started looking toward the west, the NATO military alliance, which, remember, was created to oppose the Soviets, started expanding east, bringing in former Soviet countries. Now to Russia, this felt like a direct threat, like a promise had been broken. And the warnings they sent to Ukraine were crystal clear. Joining NATO was a red line you do not cross.
Now, this massive tug of war between Russia and the West wasn't just happening on the world stage. It created a deep crack right down the middle of Ukraine itself. The country was literally being pulled in two different directions toward two very different futures.
And this wasn't just about politics, not at all. It was a cultural thing, even a language thing. In Western Ukraine, people mostly spoke Ukrainian and dreamed of joining Europe, but in the east and south, Russian was the main language, and the cultural ties to Moscow were still incredibly strong. This division, it was a political fault line just waiting for an earthquake.
Well, in 2014, that earthquake finally hit. All that simmering tension just boiled over at a single flashpoint that sent the first real shockwave around the globe: Crimea.
So what happened? In 2014, a massive pro-Western revolution in Ukraine kicked out a president who was friendly with Moscow. Russia's response was swift, and it was shocking. They sent in troops and annexed the entire Crimean Peninsula, a move that the rest of the world immediately condemned.
But you might be asking, why Crimea? Well, for one, it's a super strategic spot that's home to Russia's main naval fleet in the Black Sea. But the history is even more tangled. See, Crimea had been part of Russia for hundreds of years, until 1954, when the Soviet leader Khrushchev just gave it to Ukraine. So in Russia's eyes, they were simply correcting a historical wrong. For pretty much everyone else, though, it looked like a straight-up land grab.
And here's the thing. Crimea wasn't the end of it, not by a long shot. It was actually just the beginning. The violence quickly spread from the peninsula into the industrial heartland of eastern Ukraine, a region called the Donbas.
This is where we start hearing the word separatists a lot. In the Donbas region, pro-Russian groups with backing from Moscow took up arms. In two eastern areas, Donetsk and Luhansk, they declared their own independent republics. And that's what kicked off a brutal war that would just grind on for 8 long years.
I mean, seriously, from 2014 all the way to early 2022, eastern Ukraine was a battlefield. We're talking trenches, artillery fire, a grim throwback to wars of the past. It was this constant grinding conflict that was basically a war before the real war began.
And that brings us to the moment where it all comes to a head. This is where that long shadow of history finally falls over everything, plunging the entire region into a new and honestly a terrifying chapter.
In February of 2022, that simmering war in the Donbas didn't just boil over, it exploded. Russia launched a massive, full-scale invasion from multiple directions, bringing the absolute horror of modern warfare to cities all across the country.
So the big question is, why then? Why now? Well, experts point to a kind of toxic mix of three main motivations. First, influence. Russia wants to rebuild its power and stop Ukraine from joining the West. Second, security. They see NATO as a direct threat right on their border. And finally, historical identity. This deep-seated belief that Ukraine isn't really its own country, but just a historical part of a greater Russia.
And that's the real tragedy here, isn't it? The tools of war are brutally modern. We're talking drones, precision missiles, cyber attacks, but the reasons for the fighting, the arguments over land, the clashes over identity, these are ancient echoes from a long, painful past. It really is history repeating itself, just in a much more devastating way.
If this war teaches us anything, it's that history has a very, very long memory. The ghosts of old empires can come back to haunt us. It shows us that lines on a map can be fragile, and that old wounds, if they're never healed, can tear open decades later. It's a brutal reminder that the past is never really past. And that leaves us with the biggest question of all. What lessons are we supposed to learn from it?